Welcome back, beloved soul. This is the second story in our 9 Pillars of Character series. Today, we turn our attention to integrity, not as perfection, but as alignment. As you listen, you're invited to reflect on who you are when no one is watching. Let us begin, shall we?
The morning light came slowly to the village of Bethany, rising first over the eastern hills and spilling down into the valley like oil poured from a vessel. Nahum stood at the threshold of his home, watching the pale gold spread across the stone walls and the dust of the narrow street. His wife had already begun preparing the day's bread, and the faint scent of flour and fire drifted toward him through the doorway. He had slept poorly, not from illness or fear, but from a question that had lodged itself in his chest sometime during the night, the way a small stone lodges in a sandal and cannot be ignored. It had come to him during the evening prayers, when the congregation gathered near the temple courts, and the old words were spoken aloud. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy mountain? The question was not new to him. He had heard it many times since he was a boy, recited by teachers and elders, sung in the rhythms of worship. But last night, something in the question had turned inward. It had stopped being a list of qualifications and become instead a kind of mirror, and Nahum had looked into it. He was not a wicked man. He had not cheated his neighbors or slandered the innocent. He paid what he owed. He honored his parents. He kept the festivals and observed the laws of cleanliness. If someone had asked whether Nahum was a righteous man, most in the village would have said yes, without hesitation. But that was not the question that troubled him now. The question was not whether others thought him righteous. The question was whether he was whole, whether the man he was in the marketplace was the same man he was at his own table, whether his words carried the same weight when spoken to a stranger as when spoken to himself. He stepped into the street and walked toward the well at the center of the village. A few women had already gathered there, drawing water and speaking quietly among themselves. Their conversation paused as he approached, not out of suspicion, but simply because he was a man, and their talk was their own. He filled his jar and nodded in greeting, then turned back toward home. Along the way, he passed the house of Ezra, a merchant who sold oil and grain. Ezra was arranging his wares outside the door, squinting against the early light. He raised a hand in greeting. "Nahum," he said, "will I see you at the council gathering this evening?" Nahum paused. The council meeting concerned a disputed boundary between two families, and Ezra had asked him several days ago to speak in favor of one party. The favor was small. Ezra had said, just a word of support. It would cost nothing. But Nahum had not witnessed the original agreement between the families. He did not know the truth of the matter, and yet he had said he would consider it, because Ezra had been kind to him in the past, and because refusing felt awkward, and because he told himself that agreeing to consider was not the same as agreeing to lie. Now Ezra was waiting for an answer. "I will be there," Nahum said, "but I cannot speak to what I did not see." Ezra's face shifted slightly, not anger, but something cooler. A recalculation. "I asked only for a word," he said. "A word is not nothing," Nahum replied. He said it gently, without accusation. Then he continued home. The encounter stayed with him through the morning. He sat in the shade of his doorway and worked at repairing a broken loom, but his hands moved without thought. What troubled him was not Ezra's disappointment. What troubled him was how close he had come to giving the word anyway. How easy it would have been to soften the truth, to frame his support as general rather than specific. to speak in a way that satisfied Ezra without technically lying. He had done this before, not often, but often enough to recognize the pattern. He had learned over the years how to shape his speech to the listener, how to say yes in a way that left room for later retreat, how to say no with enough ambiguity that no one felt refused. It was a kind of skill, a social grace. But lately it had begun to feel like a kind of division, as though he were not one man, but several, each tailored to a different audience. And when he was alone, when there was no audience at all, he sometimes wondered which of those men was real. This was the fragmentation he could not name, the quiet erosion of self that came not from any single lie, but from 1,000 small accommodations. A word here, a silence there, a truth delayed until it no longer seemed urgent, a conviction held privately but never spoken aloud. He had not lost his integrity in a dramatic fall. He had simply allowed it to scatter, a little at a time, like grain spilled from a torn sack. Naam's wife came to sit beside him. She did not speak at first, only watched his hands as they worked. She had always been observant in this way, not intrusive, but present. She did not ask what was wrong. She simply waited. Finally, Noam set down the loom and looked at her. "Do you think I am honest?" he asked. She considered the question longer than he expected. "I think you want to be," she said. "I think you are not always sure what honesty costs." He nodded slowly. That was the truth of it. Naam remarked, "I have been thinking about the psalm, the one that asks who may dwell in the Lord's presence. He who walks blamelessly and does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart." From his heart, she repeated, not from his lips only. Naam was quiet for a long moment. "That is what I cannot escape," he said. "I have spoken many true things, but I do not know if I have spoken them from the heart. I do not know if I have spoken them without calculating what they would cost me, without shaping them to the listener." His wife did not console him. She did not tell him he was being too hard on himself. She simply sat with him, and her silence was a kind of honoring. If you find a moment in your own life where this reflection resonates, where you recognize the quiet distance between who you are and who you speak yourself to be, perhaps this story is for you. You are not alone in that recognition, and there is grace in naming it. The days that followed were ordinary. Naam went about his work, spoke with neighbors, attended the council meeting and said only what he knew to be true, which was very little. Ezra did not speak to him afterward. The disputed boundary remained unresolved. Life continued. But something in Naam had shifted. He had begun to notice, with uncomfortable clarity, the small places where his words and his beliefs did not align. The compliment offered without sincerity, the promise made without intention, the agreement given only to avoid the weight of refusal. None of these were great evils. They were the ordinary compromises of social life, but they had accumulated, and now he felt their weight. He thought of the proverb his father had taught him as a boy. The integrity of the upright guides them, not their cleverness, not their reputation, not the approval of others. Their integrity, their wholeness, the alignment between what they believed and what they did. This was not a rule to follow. It was a compass, a way of orienting oneself when the path was unclear. And Naam realized that he had been navigating by other stars, by the expectations of others, by the desire to be seen as good rather than the discipline of being good, by the fear of disapproval. He had not been dishonest in the way that draws public shame. He had been dishonest in the way that only he could see, and that, perhaps, was the more corrosive kind. One afternoon he sat beneath a fig tree outside the village, resting from the midday heat. A group of travelers passed on the road nearby, and among them was a young teacher whose name Naam did not know. The travelers stopped to drink from a nearby stream, and Nahum watched them from a distance. One of the men in the group asked the teacher a question about oaths, whether it was better to swear by the temple or by the gold of the temple, whether one vow was more binding than another. The teacher answered, but Nahum could not hear the full reply. Only the end of it reached him, carried on the wind. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Matthew 5, verse 37. The words settled into Nahum like a stone dropped into still water. Let your yes be yes, not hedged with conditions, not softened for the listener, not scattered into a dozen partial meanings, and your no be no, not apologetic, not disguised as delay, not withheld until the other person stopped asking. It was so simple, and yet it described everything he had been struggling to name: the multiplication of meanings, the evasion through ambiguity, the way speech could become a kind of performance shaped more by strategy than by truth. The teacher said nothing about perfection, nothing about moral superiority. He simply offered a different way, a simplification, a return to coherence. Nahum sat beneath the fig tree for a long time after the travelers moved on. A woman sits alone in her parked car outside an office building, phone in hand. She has written a message explaining why she cannot take on another project, that she is overwhelmed and needs rest. It is true. But before she sends it, she rewrites it, softens it, adds apologies she does not feel, and offers help she cannot give. She stares at the screen for a long moment, then deletes everything and types 2 sentences. She sends them before she can change her mind, and sits quietly in the silence that follows, uncertain whether she has failed or finally begun. That evening, Nahum returned home and found his wife preparing the evening meal. The light through the window was golden, and the air smelled of lentils and herbs. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked up and saw his face. Something had changed in it. Not joy, exactly, but a kind of clarity. "You have been thinking," she said. "Yes, and then?" He sat down across from her. "I have been trying to be many things to many people," he said. "I have been speaking in ways that leave room for retreat. I have been shaping my words to the listener rather than to the truth." She nodded slowly. "I do not want to do that anymore," he said. "I do not know if I can stop entirely, but I want to try. I want my yes to be yes. I want my no to be no. I want to speak from my heart, not from calculation." Lovingly, the woman who had walked beside him all those years looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across and placed her hand over his. "That is not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." They sat together in the fading light, and neither of them spoke for a while. There was no applause, no recognition from the village, no sense that the world had shifted on its axis. Only the quiet knowledge that something had been named, and that naming it was the first step toward living differently. In the weeks that followed, Nahum noticed the change not in grand gestures, but in small ones. A conversation with a neighbor, where he said clearly what he meant, even though it was not what the neighbor wanted to hear. A moment at the market where he refused to exaggerate the quality of his goods, even when the buyer seemed eager. A promise made only when he intended to keep it. These were not heroic acts. They were simply truthful ones. And yet they cost him something. The merchant Ezra remained distant. A few acquaintances seemed puzzled by his new directness. The ease of social maneuvering, the smoothness that came from always saying the expected thing, was gone. But something else had taken its place, a kind of solidity, a sense that when he spoke, the words were his own, that when he gave his word, it carried weight, that he was not scattered across a dozen versions of himself, but gathered into one. He did not become a perfect man. He still felt the pull of approval. He still caught himself, sometimes, beginning to soften a truth or delay a difficult word. But now he noticed when it happened, and noticing was itself a kind of integrity, a refusal to let the division continue unexamined. One evening, he returned to the place where he had heard the question from the song. The temple courts were quiet, the last light of day slanting through the colonnades. He stood alone and let the words return to him. Psalm 15. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy mountain? He did not recite the answer aloud, but he felt it now in a way he had not before. The one who walks uprightly, who works righteousness, who speaks truth from his heart. It was not a barrier meant to exclude. It was a description of alignment, of wholeness, of integrity. To dwell in the presence of the sacred was not to earn a place through performance. It was to become the kind of person whose inner and outer life were no longer at war, whose yes meant yes, whose no meant no, whose heart and speech and action moved in the same direction. Nahum stood in the fading light and felt, for the first time in a long while, that he was one man. Not perfect, not finished, but whole enough to begin again. The integrity of the upright guides them, not because it earns reward, not because others will notice, but because alignment is its own compass, because coherence is its own rest. The old wisdom had named it plainly. The integrity of the upright guides them. Proverbs 11 verse 3. And perhaps that is what it means to dwell in sacred presence. Not to arrive at a destination, but to walk in a way that is no longer divided. To let your words be few and true. To let your life speak the same language in every room. Nahum walked home through the quiet streets, and the stars were beginning to appear above the hills. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if his new clarity would hold against the pressures of daily life. But he knew that something had shifted, that he had chosen coherence over comfort, that he had begun, however imperfectly, to speak from his heart. And that was enough to begin. Now, let us pray. God of truth, bring our inner life and our outward life into harmony. Where we are divided, make us whole. Where our words and our ways have drifted apart, gently realign us. Teach us to walk in integrity, even when no one is watching. Amen. If this reflection has stirred something in you, if you have felt the weight of your own divided speech or the quiet longing for alignment, I invite you to share your thoughts. Leave a word in the comments about what wholeness means to you. And if you would like to journey further with stories like this one, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. The road toward integrity is not walked alone. Thank you for walking part of it here.
Thank you for sharing this sacred story with me. If it touched your heart, you may also find peace and clarity in our Meditative Reflections playlist, a series of guided meditations inspired by these very Bible stories. Each one is crafted to help you slow down, breathe deeply, and connect more fully with God's presence in your life. Remember to subscribe, leave a comment if something resonated with you, and share this with someone who may need a little hope today. Until next time, transforming minds and empowering souls, and as always, peace, love, light, and unity.